We are going to move now to comments from discussants, and there's some changes from what originally was written up in the program. A couple of people have been not been able to come. David Germano is not going to be here, nor is Mary Cameron. However, Bron Taylor is, and so I'll invite him up first. He's a professor of religious studies, University of Florida, and he'll be followed by John Grimm from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So, Bron, why don't you...
This maybe? Can I put it right on top? Or? Yeah, you can put it on top. That's good. Oops, I don't need that on the screen. Okay. Well, it's very nice to be here. I know very little about the regions in which you are specialists in, but I have been involved especially with Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, with trying to figure out what the field of religion and ecology and religion and nature are all about for at least 20 years now. It's really nice to be here, in part to see the maturing of the religion and nature field, integrating research theoretically informed by the emphasis on lived religion today, which takes us into everyday practices and also today into their environmental impacts, and beyond a focus on religious beliefs and texts alone. We're on a journey together toward a much more troubled, multivariate, multidisciplinary analysis, and I think that's all to the good. And this is precisely what we're up to with the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture and its affiliated journal, which I cordially invite all of you to join and submit your scholarly work to, respectively. Okay, I'm going to start with I'm going to be very brief today. I want to start with just a comment on categories. I really appreciate Mark Larimore's talk, which was a very sophisticated analysis drawing on the so-called lived religion school, which I think is probably especially valuable for those of you who are new to the notion. He messed with the category nicely. I'd like to begin by messing with it a bit more, specifically with the category of religion, by pushing its boundaries beyond the lived religion notion to the notion of family resemblance. The anthropologist Benson Saylor wrote a book called Conceptualizing Religion, which I think is the clearest extended exposition of the notion. And the basic idea behind taking a family resemblance approach to the study of religion is that we ought not to perseverate on where the boundaries of religion are. You know, where does religion end and that which is not religion begins? Frankly, I'm not smart enough to figure out where that boundary is, and it's been a fraught question for religious studies scholars and anthropologists for a very long time. Instead, what scholars taking this family resemblance approach do is they look at the traits and characteristics typically associated with the religion phenomena, and then try to analyze social systems and beliefs and practices to see how those sorts of variables are in play. With this kind of approach, I think we can begin to consider a wide range of other things within our kind of scholarly purview. In other words, I think some things come into view that will not normally come into view with a more conventional definition of religion that assumes some kind of belief in non-material divine beings. So I think, for example, we can begin to consider the global sustainability movement itself as a religious movement, or at least a religion-resembling movement that has been influenced by religious and ethical traditions, but is also stunningly and creatively innovative, drawing, among other things, on ethology, the study of animal consciousness and behavior, on the one hand, as well as environmental system sciences, broadly understood, on the other. I think that more attention is needed as well to the role of hybridity between traditional religious and ecological knowledges and contemporary ecosystem sciences, including the influences of contemporary environmental anthropologies and ethnobiology studies. out in the field, I've seen many, many interesting examples of such hybridity. And I was kind of, I hope, though, in some of the other talks that are coming, we'll get a little bit more thick description of such things. But I haven't seen a whole lot of that here today. But I know that this kind of thing is going on for you field workers out there. And if I can't pull it out of you here in the side meetings, send it to me for the journal so we can see more of how that's happening. Now, it's not surprising for any of you who know my work that I'd be interested in this. For my most recent book, Dark Green Religion, Nature, Spirituality, and the Planetary Future, I argued that there are important global post-Darwinian forms of nature spirituality that are spreading around the world and exercising increasing influence. I contended, moreover, that dark green spiritualities will play an increasingly important, if not a decisive role, in the religious and planetary future, especially if we think a number of generations, if not a few centuries forward. This sort of spirituality has two main forms, I argued. On the one hand, animistic forms that have to do with the relationships that human beings have with non-human organisms. And it has Gaian forms, which have already been alluded to on a number of occasions today. What I would really like to see is more attention to that sort of spirituality from those of you working in Asia, because I definitely need your help to understand the extent to which this is true in the regions you know best. Indeed, I'm interested in all aspects of what I'm calling the greening of religion hypothesis, and have some seed funds for an international workshop on this, so if you're interested, let me know. I'd like to conclude just with a riff on some taboo and troubling questions and subjects. This follows up a little bit on Georgina Drew's comments. But how should we, as scholars and as human beings, in relationship with our interlocutors around the world, work with different knowledges and epistemologies that we both bring to the encounter and encounter when we're there? Can we, as some of you have already begun to do today, consider what might be politically incorrect hypotheses, such as, is it the case that in some cases, or even generally, that the more traditional the religion, the less likely it can be integrated into a sustainability ethic because the gods are in control of the environmental system? In a recent issue of the Journal of the Study for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture just this last fall, that seems to be a working hypothesis that emerged organically from the field work. Is it possible to consider the possibility that holistic environmental science, when grafted onto religious beliefs and practices, or when these come to stand alone as meaning systems, are more promising than insular traditional religions? Put differently, and back to my troubling first point, what, if any, limits are there on the hybridity between traditional ecological and religious understandings and contemporary environmental sciences? I think both NGO people in the field, scientists and scholars, have been pulling their punches and not really addressing those difficult conundrums adequately. Okay, there's an article I have coming out in a month on this, addressing these kinds of issues in the Kenyan context. All right, there's more that can be said. There's more troubling questions that we could talk about if we have more time, but I'm just going to close there since we are on a tight schedule, and look forward to more conversations throughout the meeting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for adding some questions and our concepts, more concepts and debates into our reflections. Now, excuse me, John Grimm, you can offer your wisdom to us, and then we'll turn to questions from the floor.
Thank you, David, and with all of you, thanks to the organizers. I have to admit, Mary Evelyn and I came through the subway system, dragging our bags along, and I got a little grumpy, and she kept saying to me, "No, come along, come along. It's a good group of people." She was right. I was wrong. But for those of you who love Germanic criticism, I'm still irritated. And what's the nature of my irritation? It's a long memory. It's from some years back in the mid-90s when Mary Evelyn and I initiated this series of conferences at Harvard, and we brought together scholars primarily from different world religions. And the gathering was focused on a particular tradition and ecology, and Islam and ecology, Judaism and ecology, and so forth. And they were 4-day conferences, and there was a pattern that I saw emerge, and it put irritation in me, it put a thorn in me, and I feel something different today. That thorn is somehow being removed. For example, after the first 2 days, there was this celebratory self-reflection. These scholars from these traditions were giving comments as if their tradition answered all of the problems in the environmental environmental challenges. Until about the third day, someone would stand up and say, if we have all of the answers in our tradition, why do we have all these problems? And that's when the work began. And listening now to this gathering today, I feel like that is no longer a thorn that I need to carry. That sense of religion as being embedded in the problems, and religion is an important issue to be concerned with in environmental concerns, is right there. I can feel that discussion is no longer simply an abstract, conceptual proposition. I am very much reminded then that this transition that's occurring in the field of religion and ecology shows up in the papers that we heard. I was intrigued, Mark, that you brought us into the materiality of religion. I felt that very strongly in your emphasis on resource use. That's obviously a very good turn. You cited what ERSEH, there is no religion that doesn't bring things to hand or something, and I'm reminded again that there is no religion that doesn't stand on the planet. I find myself beginning to rethink the phrase world religions in this regard. I appreciate in Mark's paper, by the way, all of these papers, I hope you have them because they are gems to sit and read. When Mark cites at the end of his paper a particular critique of the use of the term world's religion, apostrophe S, and the referencing of that universalizing ethos in that discourse of world's religions. Who is a world religion? How do you get to be a world religion? And in this discussion in the Himalayan context, I hear something different. And the way I hear it is world religion. It's religions that are embedded in the world. And that's how I'm taking Mark's referencing us then as religions are a material reality also. Their materiality might be a way to, I would use that word to describe what I understand you were after. My concern, of course, would be the use of the word resource in this regard. Resource as, how did you put it, Mark? Decision-making, resource, wise decision-making with regard to resources. I'm concerned about the question of economism, the question of, that we're all aware of here. I don't need to go on in this regard, but one side of it I find at Yale Forestry and Environmental Studies that's very lively, namely ecosystem services. The sense of monetizing the environment so that we understand more clearly what it provides us. That's my concern with the use of the word resources, and I know you're reflective in this regard. Cameron, when we took flight in your remarks, and I wanted to revisit your paper and reflect on this comment. It's in the series of 3 points for those of you who have the paper on the second page, and it's his second point, and he's talking about humans fuse with designed things through everyday, mostly only ever semi-conscious practices. Humans fuse with design semi-conscious, and practice. It is these practical hybrids of a people and things that are the basic units of design's view of the world. Those materialized practices or practiced materialities are what hold the world together and the ways in which the world is changed. So I hear the resonance back to Mark's paper, that sense of materiality and practice, and I wondered if Clifford Geertz were in the audience, if he might perk up right away and say, that's what I meant by worldview and ethos, that's what religion is, practiced materialities in a sense. I wanted to just remember your use of the word authenticity. Also a flag went off in my mind, because I think so many of the reflections upon religion in the Himalayas gravitate towards self-cultivation. And that emphasis on self-cultivation strikes me as very interesting with regard to the way I felt you used authenticity, which took us outside of ourselves. The human, as I read in this sentence too, the human fused into this practiced materiality. It's a different type of cultivation. Where I'm going in this direction, I'm not sure, but there's something about this fused cultivation that is different than I feel the self-cultivation as I know it in the traditions in the Himalayas, what little I know of those traditions in the Himalayas. Thomas, I wish that all of us could see, read, or hear your paper read with that lovely little film called Powers of 10. I don't know if you know the film. It's on YouTube, so please take a look at it. But Thomas does in his paper, and he abbreviated much of it, his sense of scale is just wonderful. The Powers of 10 movie takes us out into the cosmos, and then it takes us into the inner world of cellular life and atomic structure. So it's this scalar movement in both directions, and I feel that's the power of your remarks also, is you bring us into a conceptual consideration of what does cosmology mean to us now. It's like you're bringing us to a new story. And cosmology, at least as insofar as I am a student of religion, cosmology is at the heart of these religious traditions. And I think it's a design motif too. Cosmology orients us and grounds us at the same time. So this sense of story was resonating through my mind as I was listening to your remarks. And then finally you put the cap on your whole agenda, it seemed to me, when you raised the question of upaya, skillful means. And it seems to me that's an arena in which everyday religion in the Himalayas is exploring upaya, the response of communities of need to these practical materialities that are confronting them out of the best skillful means possible. So thank you so much.
Well, both the commentators have demonstrated incredible skill in means, and thank you both very much for wonderful overviews of the papers and their contributions. I think we can have quite a bit of time at this point, I think, for questions, maybe 20 minutes or so. I don't know if we're going to try to do online ones or not, but why don't we have all of the speakers come up? And Ashok suggested to me that this time around what we'll do is we'll take 3 or 4 questions, pause, let them respond, and then take 3 or 4 more and sort of move along till we get near the end of our time. And so the floor is open. You've left them speechless. Oh, here, Michael Hutt.
Just to say, very much appreciate Thomas's theorization of the changes in the Kathmandu Valley. And I wondered whether you'd had anything to say and whether you could locate within that periodization and that process the growing trend of the Kathmandu middle classes to adopt new religions, as has been discussed by Gerard Toffin, Theravada, Sai Baba, and so on.
Thank you, Michael Hutt. Very interesting question.
Well, I'd certainly put it as post-Himalayan in the same way in which, that's a tendency that's I think happening in so many other places. And, you find the same spiritual leaders in say, South India and Kathmandu. And, the following is pretty much the same. They do the same things, they have follow the same kind of television shows. So I think it belongs to a non-contexted kind of spiritual space, which partakes of some global cosmopolitanism that seems to involve religion. So I think I'd put it as post-Himalayan.
Todd Lewis.
Of course, great to see lived religion as part of the discourse in religious studies. And that's fine. I was trained in both Indology and anthropology. Is there anything really new here but a terminology versus the anthropology of religion? Certainly the ideas you were speaking about are implicit in, let's say, the total work of Stanley Tambaya, for example, in Buddhism and Society. And, we always like to change fashion, and we like to Oedipally get rid of our fathers in academia so we have something new to offer. But is there anything conceptually new? Because I seem to have missed lived religion as a development.
Well, we can turn to the panelists. Seeing we don't have any other questions immediately erupting from the audience.
Yes.
Is there really something new in lived religion? For those, there was a very sophisticated review of the latest discourse over lived religion, but when it first started to emerge, I kept wondering, how is that different than what field workers have been doing for a very long time, kind of teasing out all the elements of everyday practice? And is it more a reflection of the anthropological turn in religious studies than it is in something that's kind of, a new scholarly approach? And maybe you can illuminate that for me, because I've had the same curiosity.
So do I. I think it is kind of the belated discovery of the importance of the ethnographic by those of us who've been trained as philosophers or just as historians or just as sociologists. And one thing that was sort of an adventure in this project for me was taking the lived religion debates, which are largely focused on the modern, postmodern West, and very concerned with modern, postmodern Western questions, and to see whether it could be stretched in some way into the Himalayan region, which, on my understanding, was a place that already demonstrated extensively all the kinds of practices which were thought to be, by some people, new, modern, or postmodern forms of religiosity in the possibly secularizing West. I do think that there are, as I've been thinking about it, and the resource use decisions thing is in some way kind of an expression of my own discomfort with this, because I'm extremely uncomfortable with that kind of language. A way of trying to move beyond just a turn to the micro and just a turn to the ethnographic scene by thinking about how it is we might reconfigure those things that we've studied as classically or quintessentially religious as in fact resources that are maintained by societies on the ground level. And I'm not sure how far that will go. I'm a grateful reader of Stanley Tambaya's work. Maybe you could sort of hear that in what I'm saying. So in some ways, perhaps I was not finding in the modern Western literature some things that I had learned in my readings in Asian traditions and thought, okay, well then maybe if we go to the Himalaya, maybe finally we can get this to become sort of common sense among scholars, especially those who are working in the North American sphere, who tend to be very exceptionalist in their understandings, as though there's something specific to America, specific to North America, specific to this thing about these new emerging, somewhat more hybrid forms of religion. So I don't know if that helps. I've been trying to think about lived religion not as a practitioner of it, since I'm not trained to do that, and I would love, after having some visits to these regions, to actually dirty my hands doing it. But think if there actually is some theoretical contribution that can be gleaned from it, and I'm still working on that. Do you have thoughts?
Yes, Mark.
on Todd's point, I mean, I think we have to remind ourselves that just like history became infatuated with social history, right, after intellectual history, this is a similar kind of move. But the fact of the matter is that until, you know, Ted DeBerry at Columbia, for example, did this huge translation project with many, many people, there was not access to the texts, especially in East Asia. We had very, very little texts that were translated in Confucianism or Taoism or even Buddhism. More has been translated in South Asia. But so the textual move in religion, I think, you know, was done very well at Columbia, where Todd and I were. But I think and the second point there is we couldn't even get into these countries. You couldn't go to Tibet. I mean, DeBerry was the first Fulbright scholar to China in 48, 49, and after that, you know. So what on-the-ground religion looks like wasn't accessible to people until recently. So I think just this historical reminder, but I do think that the model at Columbia was definitely, you understand the tradition, you understand the text, but you also see that these are living traditions. So what I very much appreciate about Gina's paper and the whole tone here, I think, is that these are interpenetrating, as some of you have said as well. And that, to me, brings us to, you know, another level of questions and discussion. So I appreciate the tone here very much.
Thank you. Catherine March.
I have a very inchoate question, and so if I can't make it sensible, I have a hard time figuring out exactly how to frame this question, but it revolves around the possible place of technology itself in this discussion about religion and sustainability, because it seems to me that there's still a tendency, although it's reduced the more we do have access to on-the-ground practice and things like that, to imagining religion as some more timeless moral guide to behavior, even, at least as a reference point. And along with that, a tendency to imagine these religious guides as somehow having a kind of wisdom for behavior in the world that was, is, and always will be more in balance with the world. All right, so it's sort of your idea, Tommy, of this Himalayan view, this pre-neo and pre-post, and that always begs for me the question of technology. Anthropologists, of course, have had to wrestle, and there are others who've done it more directly than I, with the question of whether or not indigenous religious philosophy, cosmology, is actually a better custodian of the planet than more contemporary capitalist Protestant, and a number of anthropologists, not the latest of which, but maybe most notable of which, Gregory Bateson, implied in a wonderful essay about in his Steps of the Ecology to Mind, that sort of said it's more integral to human consciousness to kind of get a stick and push things over than to just sort of watch them and wait for them to fall. And so one of the questions, and I'll stop because I'm going on too long in this inchoate thought, but it seems to me that there's a part of this discussion that is about, are we sure we're not mistaking the absence of a technology to wreak the kind of havoc on ecological systems with imagining that a religious system somehow provides a map for doing that? I mean, cutting the ice out of the Hudson was a different kind of relationship with the world, and it was based in it. But it seems to me rather than these, I love thinking of them as window box things. I think of window boxes as full of flowers. But instead of thinking of it necessarily as a different mental map or design for living, rather to say, well, in the one case there was ice, and in the other case there's fluorocarbons and everything else that goes into. And so I'm wondering where technology falls into this discussion of religion and sustainability.
Yes, I don't know. All I will say is kind of make you more incoherent by saying, for example, one of the things that's going on at the moment, in particular the realm I'm in, and coming from Carnegie Mellon University at the moment, I'm in the thick of this, is of course big data algorithms and what is quite often called quantified self. Okay, so these are a number of people who will engage with metrics through smart devices that will allow the smart device to tell them something about themselves they don't know. So if you sign up to Fitbit, it'll tell you how far you walk, but also whether your sleep patterns are regular or not. It can tell when you're moving and not moving, etc. And in a weird way, all these applications have a kind of pastoral component to them. So the moment at which you move from the data algorithm into the interface design is the moment at which you start thinking about the way in which this app is counselling you to begin to make modifications in your behaviour, sometimes comparative, sometimes these can be collective. So one of the first ones was called the Nike Running, and these were people who were doing marathons. They would basically run around the world and pass the baton, as it were, but they were doing it all digitally and sometimes on standing running devices, not moving anywhere. And so I think I just use all these examples as a kind of interesting way in which a certain material practices approach to religion, for example, particularly with a kind of disciplined symmetry that someone like Bruno Latour would suggest should be brought to a domain like this, suddenly opens up all these other realms to existing in the same space. And I suppose that is somewhat I was trying to draw attention to, that there's suddenly a way in which people are finding practices that you really can't, it's sort of inadequate to just keep calling them secular. I mean, so I would simply point, for example, to the people who are into singularity and believe Google will deliver artificial intelligence within the next 20 years and government will be run by these kind of algorithms. I mean, it is, it's not just facetious to call it a religion. And so there is a strange mix now between the kind of lived religion version, which is the Fitbit quantified self, and the kind of institutional religion, which is acquiring vast amounts of money in terms of big data algorithms. Now, all of that is a very Northwestern perspective. I think a more interesting version of your question, which I can't answer at all, is when, for example, someone is using photovoltaic cells to do data monitoring of the size of a glacial lake to work out whether it's going to glough or not, and what that kind of does to an understanding of a sacred space, is also another version of your same question, I would think. But to that I fall silent.
Yes, please.
This is also sort of an inchoate question that has to do with creativity, design, religion, and the environment. So, in other words, it seems like these in traditional sort of indigenous ways of practicing creativity. Creativity was in the designs that came out of daily life, and creativity seemed to be inspired by the approach to nature and religion and cosmology. I mean, it came out of the worldview at that time, which seemed to be linked to nature and religious concepts or faith feelings. And now it seems within this secular technological era that creativity has been de-linked from that. And I know it sounds weird, but it seems to me as if creativity has become untrammeled creativity with and the creation of designs which have no real rooting in social responsibility. What are the social costs of what you're creating? Whereas before there were the costs of what you were creating were taken into account when you created it. So a lot of even the crafts and the arts and so on had to do with a sustainable kind of practices, and also the concepts of sustainability seem built into creativity. So I was just wondering because I know often when I think of technology is, a lot of these things there's this rampant creativity that's rushing ahead and creating without any, it seems wonderful things are coming out of it, but at the same time, no regard for, no anchoring in a worldview or value system or anything like that to do with religious or environmental concern.
Thank you.
So two quick comments. The first is that it was my rapid education in religious studies when we did a tour of Patan in Kathmandu, and we were looking at the water delivery system, the incredible infrastructure for water delivery system that were nevertheless coded as Naga. And so I just had a classic experience that I just recalled when I was reading Bruno Latour's a book about fetish, the typically kind of sort of reaction. How can you possibly call something that you have obviously participated in the creation of religious? I mean, you've constructed this irrigation system and you've carved this particular sculpture, so, obviously you made it. It's not religious. And so that was the first kind of moment at which recognizing that one's participation in the construction of a religion does not invalidate, therefore, the religiosity of what it is. And Bruno Latour's point, of course, is this is exactly what a scientist is doing when Pasteur tells you there are germs that are infecting the milk, and it's exactly the same thing. He can't show it to you, he has to kind of make it, but he says, no, forget about this is just, and it's the same thing that's happening in that particular setting. No, it's still sacred, even though obviously I participated in the construction of it. So my first answer is just this very quick response, this interesting coupling in actually participating in the material construction of the religion. Every artifact has to be carved by a particular artisan, and yet is no less sacred for that. So that's my first answer. My second would almost be to throw it to Tommy and say that I think some of the situations we're looking at are alienated creativity, the kind of engineering version of creativity. And in creativity studies, there is a parallel to religious studies in that there are people desperately trying to find everyday creativity, which can be coded as creativity but gets dismissed as non-creative because it's not with a capitalizable excess. And so again, the question falls back to scale, and one of the interesting things is when the creativity is done within those social contexts and is done using particular more manual or human-driven power, it's all based on the kind of renewable energy that is humans, there is a reversibility to the nature of the intervention. And this is Jonas's point, Hans Jonas is the ethicist of technology's point, that at some point you start reaching scales of technology that lead to irreversibility. Or Ulrich Beck's argument that we're now negotiating with technologies for which there is no experiment in the laboratory that can tell you what is right or wrong. The world has to become your experiment. You have to release genetically engineered crops into the world to see if they're going to cause superweeds. You can't do that in the laboratory. And so I think there's this question of reversibility also in the point you're making about when creativity moves to that kind of alienated form, it is irreversible. It's not error-friendly in the way that I heard Tommy saying.
I think we have time for one more question. Professor, yes.
Kamal Bava, let me bring in the issue of knowledge. I think references have been made more than once to development of the local place-based models in terms of linking everyday religion with sustainability issue. And this is a very practical question. And also references were made, I think, in the morning to religious studies in Indian institutions. And my question is for Thomas. How do you see changes in the institutions in the region in terms of addressing some of these issues? I know a couple of people made references to the non-government organizations, but I think the primary action, as we all know, in the Himalaya lies with other knowledge generation institutions, and how do you see them changing, and what do you see their role?
Well, I think, institutional forms of knowledge have their own inertia. There's a particular process it goes through, and I think there are discussions in the philosophy of science which talk about how, knowledge moves from one track to another. But when this knowledge has a nexus with money, with certain global forms of thinking, I'm not so sure that large institutions can really deliver anything, because they're always looking at big scales. And on the one hand, yes, you can comprehend the crisis on a planetary scale, but I don't think you can actually cognize solutions on that scale. And I think the big problem is that there is a disconnect between the level at which institutions are thinking about problems and solutions and the actual levels at which or the way in which the problems exist. It may be a local local communities in the inner Tarai, or it may be a hill communities doing terrace farming, or it may be transhumans up in the in the mountains. And you always find that there is some problem in the way in which there's some disconnect in the way in which the problem is posed by big institutions and the way it's actually posed by those who are experiencing problems. So I think there are I'm not very optimistic about large institutions delivering appropriate knowledge.
Well, thank you very much. That was superb papers, obviously inspired lots of interesting and intelligent questions and great commentary from our commentators. So I think we're ready to move on to tea and more further discussion.